Well, welcome everyone to this next session of My Grazing's webinar series. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us and to have Jim Gerrish again here with us. And thanks so much to the support of Foothills Forage and Grazing Association in Alberta, Canada. For many of you, it's getting pretty late over there in North America, but we've got hundreds of people on the call. I think all up there was something like 600 registrations. So we are quite overwhelmed with it, particularly in this time where everyone's getting hammered with webinars and so forth. But it's great to have Jim along again. This was a session that was really a lot of pent-up demand around effectively paddock design. So Jim will be going through everything that he's learned over the years, and we'll also hear from some of our grazier friends around the planet as well. So I'll just jump into the agenda. So straight up, a little bit like some of our other webinars, we've had a few people write in to give us their tips and tricks and share the key things that they feel strongly about on the topic. Then we'll just move into Jim talking about planned grazing fundamentals and paddock design 101. Then I'll just jump into my grazing and talk a little bit about defined units of record, but Jim will introduce that in his talk as well. And just talking about a little bit about how the simplicity is such a critical factor in this space. During the session, I'll put out a little a message to you all. Feel free to put comments down, add questions directly to the presenters, to Jim or myself, or chat amongst yourselves as you hear things that are talked about during the session. So I'll send a message out to everyone during that. It should be fairly obvious on how to interact with us. Now, let's jump into a couple of these messages that have coming in from around the globe in the last few days. But I haven't put names and locations to people just to keep people's privacy there. I wasn't sure whether they wanted to share, but this was a good one. Your wire is only good as your water. The next one that came in: design equally for your best and worst seasons. The next one here: think big, design to your vision, but start with what you can manage. I think that's all about really, regardless of where you think you might be able to end up short term, think big and design big, because ultimately you don't want to be doing a redesign in 6 months' time or another 1 or 2 grazing seasons' time necessarily. Design around your landscape's function and your animal's natural instincts. I think that may be it, but there's one more here. It took some readjustment, but I finally cracked it with my paddock design when I disregarded what I already had in place and started from scratch. Now, there were several emails that came through with a similar sort of theme here, and this was actually raised in a webinar last week we ran with Dallas Mount from Ranch Management Consultants, Grazing for Profit in the States, and Bart Davidson here at Maya Grazing. They touched on that a bit too, and I'm sure there's people on the call that were on that one last week as well. Just before Jim launches into his session, I thought I'd just share a little bit of worthwhile news from our Maya Grazing community. Charlie Arnott, a grazier here in New South Wales, Australia, has just in the last few days launched a podcast series on really discovering people's regenerative journeys in agriculture and production and so forth. And I thought it was worthwhile sharing this because not only are there fantastic people on the upcoming webinar series, including Charlie Massey and Joel Salatin. I actually listened to the Joel Salatin podcast last night at about 2 a.m. when I woke up freaking out how to deliver, what am I going to deliver today? And, as much as people have heard from a lot of these top leaders in the industry, there's always something new you can learn. And I think Charlie has done a great job in sort of pulling this out of people in these podcasts. There's Sarah Schmood, Damien Gamo coming up, but more importantly, and the reason why I talk about it today is this also in the next few days or week or so, there'll be an interview with the one and only Jim Gerrish when Charlie and Jim caught up in January here in Australia, February, sorry, this just passed. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jim, and let's get into it.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I think you still need to hit stop share. All right, there we are. And I presume that everyone can, hear me just fine here. So I'll say good evening, good morning, good whatever time of day you have going on. I understand we have a few people from the UK plugged in, and it's like 3 o'clock in the morning for those people. And I have to say that is dedication when you're willing to be up at 3 in the morning to catch a webinar live. I believe I would have slept in and listened to it tomorrow. So as Carl indicated, we're going to talk about fundamentals of pasture subdivision, talking about some of the why we do it, and then focusing more on the how part of the approach. So these are some of the reasons why we subdivide pastures. It's trying to gain control of our production system, of the pastures, the livestock, our marketing, everything comes into play. And there's a long list there that you can read, and at the bottom it says, and many more. I think every year that goes by that I continue to do this, I realize there's additional benefits, things I didn't think about years ago that now I'm realizing, wow, this really does make a difference. Now, the more that you want to control and manage things, the more subdivision you need. I've already emphasized this in a couple of the other webinars that I am really focused on management of time increments. Historically, in grazing and conventional ranching industry, we've been more focused on managing space. And we just think about the stocking rate out there. If we have the right number of animals, we just go with that. But it's really time that becomes important. Went a little fast there. Okay, and this is in the 40 plus years that I've been involved in grazing management, practice, research, education. One of the things that I really had to learn from scratch is that managing time is the most important component of successful grazing management. When I was being educated, it was all about stocking rate relative to space. Very few people were thinking in terms of the critical component of time management. We can talk about Alan Savory and what he did for the promotion of time in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. The promotion of time is a component of management. We go further back to Andre Voisin from the 1920s to 1960, and clear back to James Anderson in Scotland in the late 1700s, emphasizing that the management of time, both the duration of the grazing period and the length of the recovery period, are the key components of grazing management. The reason this time management is so important is when we think about the grazing cycle, which is made up of a grazing period and then a recovery period, during the grazing period, so that's the time when the pasture is actually being exposed to grazing livestock, mostly negative things are happening from the perspective of the pasture, plant, and soil. We have photosynthesis being reduced, the root system is contracting, direct energy flow to soil microbes is reduced. The one positive thing that's happening is through urination and defecation, the animals are, and trampling of plant materials, there are minerals and carbon being returned to the soil. But mostly negative things are happening. So one of the keys to success is the shorter the duration of the grazing period, the shorter time that we have negative things happening, and the sooner the pasture can begin recovery. During the recovery period, mostly positive things are happening. We take the animals away, leaves start to regrow, so photosynthesis is increasing, and it will continue to increase up to the point of the pasture reaching a certain level of maturity. After we have restarted energy flow in the plant, the root system can start expanding. We have direct energy flow to the soil microorganisms again. Nutrients are being released from feces. So mostly positive things are happening. Now, we need to, as part of our management, focus on optimization of the recovery period. We can have recovery periods that are too short. The plants are not fully recovered when we put animals back on, and that's stressful for the plants. Also, we can have recovery periods that are too long, in the sense that we are missing opportunity. We have our pasture sward, our solar panel, sitting there in a stagnant state. And even though the sun is shining and we might have moisture available and there's a lot of biomass out there, we're not actually creating any more new feed. So that's missed opportunity. So optimization of the recovery period, balance to the duration of the grazing period, those are key components of grazing management. When we look at a high natural rainfall or irrigated pasture situation, and we think about this context of time, very often we're focusing on grazing utilization at that moment in time. You know, what did we leave behind yesterday? How much feed do we allocate today? We're looking at really trying to maintain our plant community, our pasture sward, at an optimum level of photosynthesis. So we have some fairly short-term focuses there, really trying to fine-tune what's happening in the plant community on this day. When we move to a more extensive environment, to a arid or semi-arid range environment, what we're more concerned with is very long-term effects. And rather than thinking about the utilization level at a square foot or a square yard, square meter, for those of you who, you know, still worship the Queen or the French or, you know, some damn thing, we are in rangeland, we're thinking in the longer term of how is my grazing action of this day or this week or this month affecting recovery opportunities for the remainder of the year? How's it going to affect next year? But also, when we look at these big landscapes, we need to think about how are we utilizing the entire landscape? Are we getting our money's worth out of the investment that we had made in this land base? We use the management of time, the subdivision of space, so that we can manage in smaller and smaller increments of time. That is the basis of subdividing pastures. So before we start the process of running out there and building a bunch of fence, there's things we need to think about. And these are, you know, important considerations. What exactly is your resource? What is its productivity? What is its seasonality? What is the landscape like? We know that steepness of the landscape dramatically affects where animals, or particularly cattle, are willing to graze. So we have to be looking at what is our resource. Within the context of our resources, then we develop goals. Part of understanding your resource are things like, you know, working with the terrain, different soil types and their relative productivity in the parts of the world where we actually have real seasonality. North-facing slopes, south-facing slopes behave differently. We have different levels of productivity. If you're in an irrigated environment, is it a center pivot? Is it K-line? Is it flood irrigation? The grazing cell design is going to look very different for those different types of irrigation systems. Generally, when I'm doing a plan for someone, we do more than one option. We will present almost always 2 options, sometimes 3 or 4 options, because it's only the manager, the operator of the ranch, who really knows what can they accomplish, what are they willing to do. So we present different options. We look at the cost-benefit relationship, and it's only after we do all of those things that we go out and start sticking fence posts in the ground or burying pipelines. I thought that one liner from the grazer, that the very first one that Carl presented, that your wire is only as good as your water. Man, that hits a nail on the head. Stock water availability is the key to determining where cattle, to a lesser extent sheep, but really where cattle are going to be willing to spend their time grazing. So we have the opportunity to work with natural water resources, and because the one of the basic laws of ecology is water runs downhill, natural water sources tend to be lower on the landscape. And if you have a large ranch that is like a foothills ranch, water is always moving towards the lower side of your ranch and eventually escaping from your ranch. So we have choices of working with natural water sources or developing water sources. With developed water sources, pumps and pipelines and tanks, we can place water on the landscape to really help us optimize grazing distribution. Relying entirely on natural water sources does put some limitations on how far you can push the optimization of grazing distribution. So as we talk through the rest of this, keep those things in mind. And as you're thinking about your own properties and what you might do, always recognize water is the key. Developing water can be a proposition in terms of cost. Depending on what the base level of productivity in your environment is, generally we see investments in stock water development having a very, very good return on investment. Sometimes we encounter properties where the base productivity level is so low, we don't see the benefit that we see in most environments. But we always start our grazing cell planning from the perspective of what do I have for water? Where can I cost effectively put water? Excuse me a minute. I'm going to show, I think, 3 different research examples that really illustrate the importance of water location. So this work was done in, I think, the late 1980s, early 1990s in the US in Wyoming. And in this particular study, they were looking at a 2,500 acre range unit, that's 1,000 hectares, and measuring the use of available forage by grazing animals. The way we typically do this research, we will start at a watering point, and then that measured increments moving away from that water point, you measure the availability of forage before and after a grazing event. And if it's a longer grazing period, like set stocking, you do it periodically through the season. So what they found in this study, 77% of grazing occurred within 1/4 mile, that's 400 meters of water source. Now, when I lived in the rainy part of the US, the 38, 40-inch precipitation zone that was Missouri, I was under the impression that cows out in the American West on rangeland, they'd walk 10 miles between water holes with a smile on their face, and come to learn that is absolutely not true. A lot of ranchers would be offended at the idea that cows don't walk much more than a 1/4 mile away from a water source. Now, in this particular study, 65% of the rangeland was more than a 1/4 mile from water. Rangeland close to water was degraded. What was over 3,000 feet or 900 meters was underutilized. This is the real bottom line. When we look at the cost of the ranch and the value that we're getting from it, or the return we're getting from it, 77% of the grazing was coming from just 35% of the pasture. That means 65% of that ranch is really not paying the bills. Why do people go broke? Because of stuff like this. This was from down in Texas, hotter environment, flatter environment than where the Wyoming work was done. But again, doing the same type of work, measuring utilization as they moved away from water. At 1,600 foot to 2,640 foot, that's a half mile. So 500 to 800 meters from water, they could measure change in utilization. Now, a change in utilization, being able to measure it statistically is one thing. A change in utilization that affects the bottom line of the ranch is something a little different. And in this study, Jerry Stuth, who I knew well back in the day, they determined that it was economically valuable to develop water when the travel distance exceeded 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile. Cattle prices were lower then. As the value of our product goes up, what you can afford to pay for water development also increases. This is some more Texas work, different study from Jerry Stuth's work, but this is a commonly used table in a lot of extension publications and conservation service publications in the U.S. For justifying stock water development. So what you see is if the target use of a grazing unit is 50%, classic take half, leave half, that was being accomplished only if the cattle were within a half mile of water. If they were traveling half a mile, but not more than a mile, use dropped to 38%. Now, don't think that's a 12% reduction in utilization. If the target is 50%, utilization dropping to 38%, that's actually a 24% reduction in carrying capacity. That becomes significant, quite significant. Now we get into a hot, humid, a very productive environment, but hot, humid, high-stress environment. This is work we did in Missouri. This was with British breed cattle. It's not with Brahman, Zebu, anything else. Looking at just 10-acre pastures where the maximum travel distance, and we were comparing square pastures to rectangular pastures at different length width ratios in this study. And what we saw is 800 feet from water, cattle don't do very much grazing if it's in a high stress, hot, humid environment. So in those kind of environments, we have an even shorter optimal travel distance to water. So we have different planning criteria that we use depending on what the heat and humidity is, productivity of the environment, things like that. Bottom line is stock water development is absolutely essential for grazing, cell planning, and it is the starting point for developing your plan. All right, so let's think about if you are going to subdivide pastures, how much fence do you actually need to build? Frequency of rotation is going to be the primary determinant. If you're planning on moving every 10 days, that takes a certain amount of fence. If you're planning on moving every 2 days or every day, that takes a whole lot more fence. And just a few minutes from now, we'll discuss the relative merits of permanent fencing versus using temporary fencing for doing these things. But as you make more subdivisions, every pasture is going to get more recovery time. Travel distance is reduced because they're in a smaller area. And the benefits of shorter time, smaller areas, they just add up, go on and on. So how big should we make a pasture? Well, there's some obvious considerations. How much grass is out there? If every time you come to pasture, there's 2 tons of forage standing in it, the pasture doesn't have to be near as big as if each time you come to it, there's only 600 pounds of forage standing there. How many animals are going to be in the herd? What's the weight of those animals? How frequently do you want to rotate? Those are what is going to determine how big do we need to make each one of these increments. Now, things to consider is animals grow, don't they? The herd is getting bigger, heavier. It's going to demand more feed. Grass does not grow at the same rate every day of the year. So we can't always count, every day we're going to have some amount of feed out there. It's a dynamic system, and we have to develop grazing cells that we can respond to in a dynamic and flexible way. These are some of the criteria that I use at what I would call mid-latitudes. So from, let's say from 30 to close to 45 degrees latitude, probably more like 42. The one thing that my experience has taught me, and I believe very, very firmly, is an inch of water will grow more forage at upper latitudes than it does at lower altitudes. Working here in North America, an inch of water will grow a lot more grass in Canada than it will in Kansas. So we use the criteria of, we look at what your average annual precipitation is, and for each 10 inches of precipitation that you receive, we plan for one grazing cycle. So if your total annual precipitation is 10 inches, absolutely, we're going to say you graze once a year and no more than that. We'll look at an example of this. So we're at a location, the annual precipitation is 18 inches. We're going to plan 1.8 rotations through the pasture. So every pasture gets grazed once during the growing season, and 80% of our pastures are going to get grazed the second time. Now, very often that second grazing takes place during the dormant season. Some of the pastures are going to get grazed twice during the active growing season, but we will always make a point of not grazing a pasture twice during the active growing season in successive years. So that's part of the grazing planning that needs to come into play. And when I'm done with this session, as Carl said, he's going to talk a bit about Maya grazing. And when you get into this type of management that's based on precipitation regime, you got to have some pretty good records to know which pastures were grazed at what time of the year in 2020, so that you can plan accordingly your 2021 grazing plan to not double up on pastures that have already been grazed twice in this year. As years go by, my idea of how long we should allow cattle to stay on a particular pasture in a rangeland environment, it keeps getting shorter and shorter. I used to think 2 to 3 weeks was fine, and then I say, well, 10 days to 2 weeks. And really, I am down to about a 5 to 7 day length of stay on rangeland pastures. And that really revolves around rumen function. In our rangeland environment, all the forage that we have available for the year basically grows in a 2-month or even less period. And I know from my visit to Queensland and some other parts of Australia that it is a short rainy season. You grow the forage in a small window of time, and then you have to budget it out, ration it out for the next 300 days. And because animals always selectively graze, they will high grade the high protein material out of pastures once they've ended active growth. And if we ask animals to stay on those much longer than just this 5 to 7 day period, we will put them in a state of chronic protein deficiency. So we spend money on supplement to take them out of that. But we can change the way that we manage the grazing to help provide that protein availability. So this is how we figure out how many paddocks we need. If we're looking at this property providing year-round grazing, and we say, okay, we're going to have an average of 5 days grazing period. We take 1.8 cycles. That's based on our 18 inches of precipitation. We divide that 90 into 365 days. It says we need 40 pastures. Now here's where the kicker comes in, and some people don't think about. That is 40 pastures per herd of livestock. If you're running 5 separate herds on your place, that's 200 pastures. In ranching for profit and in holistic management training, it was always emphasized consolidate herds. Consolidate herds. And this is one of the key reasons why. If you can consolidate your herds, you reduce the number of paddocks, pastures that you have to create. And by doing that, by increasing that number, it's way more capital investment, it's more management, and you're not gaining all the recovery benefit that you possibly could. All right, so now let's go to a wetter environment. In a wetter environment, we plan one rotation for every 7 inches of precipitation. And here we're looking at 3 to 4 days length of stay. Why don't we stay any longer than that? Because with moisture, grasses recover quickly. And within 3 to 4 days after a pasture, a plant has been bitten off, it can already be regrowing. We bite it again, we do reduce the productivity of that plant. So now let's look at 365-day grazing season with an average of 3-day length of stay, but because we're up at about 30 inches of precipitation, we're going to run 4 grazing cycles. So here we need 31 pastures. Again, emphasizing that's 31 pastures per herd. So let's think about how do you create these 20, 30, 50, 200 pastures. We have 2 basic approaches to grazing cell development. We have fixed grazing cells, which are based on permanent fence and watering points. And when I say permanent fence, I'm not talking about, woven wire or 5 strands of barbed wire. For cattle, we're pretty well 1 or 2 strands of electrified high tensile. If we're dealing with sheep or goats, we're looking at 3 wires. To us, that's a permanent fence. That's all the force of fence that we need to control grazing if we're talking about permanent fences. We don't need to talk about that, but we use entirely electric fences, so self-insulating posts make sense. Permanent stock water points, the size of that tank depends on the herd that you're running there, your recharge rate, the travel distance to water, things like that. But a key factor is when you put in a permanent stock water point, it becomes the focal point of animal behavior. Remember, whether we're talking about natural water sources or developed water sources, where that water is located is the most powerful influence that we're going to have on where animals spend their time. So we want to put a lot of good thought into where we locate those tanks. Generally, in environments north of, I'll say 35 degrees latitude or south of 35 degrees latitude, where we have real seasonality, we do end up burying water pipes so that we can have grazing capacity in the winter. We could spend, an hour talking about just that sort of thing. We'll move on from there. When we do put in pipelines and tanks, we're generally looking at troughs serving more than 1 pasture. It is expensive. Particularly if you're going to do it right, have a durable watering site that isn't going to turn to mud, that's accessible in all seasons. It's expensive to put in a permanent watering point. So once again, let's do it right. Let's optimize their location so that they're serving as many acres as feasible. Our farm in Missouri was 260 acres, which I know for some of you guys and gals running on 20,000, 40,000, 80,000, a million acres. Oh, it's just a hobby block. Yeah, it was a hobby block, but in that environment, that was still a beef cattle operation year-round grazing because it was a productive environment. So this is what our place actually looked like. We had a lot of permanent fences, and all the red lines are permanent fence. Blue lines, obviously, are water lines. The tanks are marked, and then where there's not a tank at an intersection of fence, there would have been a quick coupler valve to attach a movable water tank. So we had 76 paddocks on that place. On that 260 acres, there was 26 miles of permanent electric fence. That was a lot. I got carried away. My wife was in the fence business. She sold it to me cheap. What can I say? All right, so here's a fixed grazing cell on one of our client ranches. This is in the Sandhills of Nebraska. Almost 9,000 acres there. There were 18 permanent pastures on this place when we started working with them. Now, they didn't rotate through those 18 pastures. Each one of those pastures had a set stocked herd in it based on how much water the windmill in that pasture can provide. We did a stock water development. The dark blue lines and dark circles are new tanks. The yellow lines are additional electrified high tensile fence. So they went from having 18 pastures to having over 60 pastures there. In 3 years' time, they doubled their carrying capacity, cut their hay feeding from 3 to 4 months to less than 30 days, and got a whole lot more profitable than they were before. That's a fixed grazing cell on a larger operation. Now, one of the relationships that we work with a lot is what is the relative amount of fence that it takes to enclose an acre in a big operation versus a small operation. To take a small operation, and I'll go real small, 10 acres, split it up into 10 1-acre pastures with permanent fence, it's going to cost you a whole lot per acre. I haven't updated these prices in a long time. It's probably over $100 an acre now. But if we look at a section of land, 640 acres, and split it into 10 64-acre pastures, it's $7 or $8 an acre. Who has a better chance of paying for it? Obviously, the larger the grazing cell, the lower the cost per acre to develop it, and the more likely it is to pay off. Same thing with water systems. It's expensive to water just a few head of livestock. It's cheap to water hundreds of head. We look at it on a per head basis. So advantages of a fixed grazing cell, it's relatively low cost of large operations. There's minimal daily labor because you're not moving fences or water tanks around. And if you buy quality material, install it correctly, it's low maintenance. Disadvantages on small operations, it's very high cost. And that field is always the same size, and you have all these fences in the way, it limits management flexibility. That brings us to the alternative of a flexible grazing cell design, and that uses a portable, a framework of portable, of permanent fence, and then we use portable fence and water facilities within it. There's not a whole lot of permanent infrastructure that goes into a lot of our flexible grazing cells. If it's a seasonal enterprise, you're just grazing during the growing season, we don't even have to bury the pipelines. We just run them over the surface. We use these quick coupler valves to attach the movable tanks. Way less investment compared to a fixed system. How big of a movable tank do you need? Well, it depends on how many head you're trying to water, what the travel distance is, what the recharge rate is. This particular tank right here is watering 550 cow-calf pairs, but they are never more than about 450 feet away from a water tank. You can't even see the single wire high tensile fences in the background there. As far as you can see to the foot of, that distant ridge, every 330 feet, which is 100 meters, there's a fence line that goes across there. Every other fence line has a water line on it. Quick coupler valves are placed 100 meters apart. So you can set a tank every 100 meters. That is 1 hectare right there, 2.5 acres. Those 550 pairs, they are being moved 3 or 4 times a day. So moving these fences around, if you use the right tools, it's easy work. Just out the window there, you can't see it. I can hold my computer there and show you. There's a 300-acre center pivot out there. We'll see how it's subdivided in a little bit. But my daily chores out there, I've got 415 calf pairs out there right now. I move a little over 1,000 foot of fence. I move those cattle every day. So my chores involve taking down a fence, setting up for the next day's grazing. And I'm not as young as I used to be. I'm 64 years old. I still go out and move 1,000 foot of fence in less than a half an hour. That's taking it down and putting it back up. So it doesn't have to be hard work to move these fences around. Just use the right tools. braided. We use only braided polywire because of better strength, conductivity, visibility on geared reels, because I'm not going to waste my time using a straight crank reel. And we use step and post because I'm not going to waste my time pounding something into the ground. Use the right tools, we can move that very quickly. Here's our farm again, and we set up that permanent grazing cell all back in the 1980s. If I knew then what I had learned by 2000, we would not have put 76 paddocks out there. We would not have put 26 miles of electric fence out there. We would have laid out a flexible grazing cell, and these areas, these long pastures we make, we call those grazing corridors. It would have been grazing corridors, and we would have done all of our subdivision with movable fences. Would have saved a lot of capital cost up front and would have given me a lot more management flexibility. So here's what the pivot layout is like. People ask me, well, how many paddocks do you have out on that center pivot? And I say, well, how many do you want me to have? We have, each pivot has 3 permanent fences. The outside perimeter, this inner circle fence, which is half the distance from the pivot center to the outer reach. And then there's, each pivot has a connector fence that hooks inner and outer circle together. You know what this is? It's a grazing corridor. You know what this is? It's a grazing corridor. It just happens my grazing corridors are round and not rectangular. You can, the pink fences illustrate placement of the temporary fences. Right now, as I'm moving, we started grazing 10 days ago, which, by the way, we had, last week we had snow 3 different days. And there's ice behind the pivot every morning, so we're not growing a whole lot of grass yet. But 415 pairs right now, I am giving them about 20 acres a day, or had been giving them 20 acres a day starting out. Yesterday, I had dropped to about 15. Yesterday, I gave 12 acres. The grass growth rate is changing, so my management needs to change. So in a 10-day period of time, I've dropped from giving 20 or needing 20 acres a day to feed that herd to 12 acres a day to feed that herd. 1 month from now, I'll probably be down around 5 or 6 acres is all it takes to feed them. And with this type of flexible grazing cell, we can set those polywires wherever we need to create whatever size allocation you need. And this brings us to, well, how do I keep grazing records in this if my fences are always in a different position? That brings us to the idea of what is a unit of record. A unit of record is not necessarily the same as a paddock. And so you can see all of these lines that I have drawn in on the pivots. Those are not permanent fence locations. There is not always a fence put on those locations, but this is the basis on which I keep my unit of record. So in productive lands, I think I look at a unit of record and I think of it as about a 3 to 7 day grazing feed supply. On rangeland, I look at units of record and I think of that about them being in the 10 to 14 days of grazing opportunity. All right, so there's the unit of record. Where do we take it from there? Well, we go to Maya Grazing, and this is my dashboard, and here is our that same pasture layout that I've just shown you. And so this pasture right here, this is paddock 26. It's highlighted. That is the unit of record. On the first grazing cycle of the year, that might be just 1 day to get the whole thing. Next time through, it might be split into 2. It might be into 3. It might be into 5. There was 1 year where I had tremendous production, and it was actually taking me 6 and 7 days to get across these ones here. This is where our most productive soil is. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Carl, and he's going to pick up with this idea of record keeping in a flexible grazing cell, and this idea of how do you identify your unit of record. So it's over to you, Carl.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'll just get the screen share back happening again. and we'll move it from there. Just while I'm doing that, I've just been going through the whole list of people on the call, and yeah, it's we've got a great lineup of people. It's wonderful to see so many people. I can't sort of shout out individually to you all, but you know who you are. It's been great to be seeing a lot of you in North America in the last few months before I dashed back to Australia because of COVID. But it's wonderful to have you with us. Now, look, I thought that was awesome, Jim, and I'm so glad that you really referenced, you know, smaller producers as well. You know, like not just these large, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres, or 500 acres, whatever. You mentioned down to 10-acre operations and how this is as relative and relevant for them. So we've had a bunch of comments coming in from people on the call that do run smaller operations saying, am I going to be hearing information which is relevant to me? So that's fantastic. I'm not sure if you had any comment on that before I just launch into this little bit. But is that the case? I mean, just keeping it really, really brief there, Jim, how much of what we're talking about and you're talking about today is as relevant for a 10-acre property as it is for a 5,000? Well,
on a 10-acre property, you better be looking at a flexible grazing cell. So just as an illustration, a lot of you participants out there hopefully are, you know, buying fence products from American GrazingLands Services from our son Galen. So Galen has 4.5, I think it's about 4.5 acres of pasture that is set up in 2 corridors. He runs goats and pasture poultry using electric netting to subdivide those corridors. So he is doing MIG, very intensive management, on a 4.5 acre, you know, homesteader type property. So yeah, it's very relevant.
There you go. Great. Thanks.
Then, I was just going to say, yeah, we have clients that run on 1 million acres.
Yeah, likewise. So no, that's great. Thanks, Jim. And we'll cover more off in the Q&A, but I just thought I'd jump in that there. You know, Maya Grazing, this is all about keeping it simple, right? And you're talking about defined unit of record, not necessarily being a permanent paddock layout, etc. I'll jump into just an example, but you really ran through it quite well with Circle Pi there, with the pivots and so forth. But you know, really having the defined units of record allow you to then utilize these data and the records that you're keeping to ensure that you can make the best informed decisions going forward. It's not a matter of record keeping for record keeping's sake and retrospective interest factor. Maya Grazing is all about being able to manage your operations, being able to have the internal planning tools and the analytics. And all this is made possible because of defined units of record, whether they be grazing records to pasture sizes and paddock sizes, or defined units of record in relation to consumption of animals and different stock classes, defined units of record around enterprises where people may have breeding enterprises, people may have trading enterprises. And what allows you to make these proactive decisions is essentially what is common, and these defined units of record. So what I'll do is just I'll try and just draw on my screen here. But to Jim's point earlier, I'll just click something and see if I can get this to work. For instance, a defined unit of record on this ranch here, on this particular permanent paddock, is what we're looking at here. Now, Jim said, you know, early in the grazing season, he may be looking at a 20-acre section for his first graze, needing 20 acres to get through that first day. And let's fast forward a little bit. That may get smaller and smaller and smaller as the grazes go on, and that may be the first pass. You know, the second time he goes around, we may be looking at an entirely different setup, and the pattern of how he's using his grazing is entirely different again. So where we've got, and then the third time may be different again, the fourth time different again, the fifth, sixth time, etc., and so on. What's really important is not being able to try and second guess what all these individual grazers do and how do I keep record of it and what have you. What matters, what fundamentally matters, is the aggregated value of the defined unit of record. It is ultimately what is going on within this section here. And by not tying yourself in knots, by just recording what you do and getting on with it, you're able to start to get a whole bunch of analytics come through that start to then build your ability to plan forward and to understand what is the relationship between management, animals, and the landscape here. So here we're just this same field aggregated up all those different grazers through that different sequencing, through the different intensities at the different levels of pasture subdivision within this permanent unit of record. We can see here, and this is just instantly going for the last 365 days, I've actually consumed just over 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. And you can see here all these other bits of analytics that are also made possible because you have this defined unit of record. Because of that, there's endless amounts of sort of reporting that you can actually do that gives you that analytical value. Within Maya Grazing, then that allows you to go into your graze planning with a level of confidence, whether that be for a non-growing season plan or a growing season plan, being able to go back into your defined units of records for individual pastures to see, well, have I been able to achieve this level of consumption previously? Where does this sit now with my calculated days of grazing associated with this pasture and this planning? All of these details are in the planning tools, etc. in Maya Grazing. We can go through these things with you one-on-one. Our support team are always working with our customers, etc., to help them use the tools. But the point being, when you need a defined unit of record to be able to manage this, and this is what we do very well in Maya Grazing. Ultimately, the challenge of what we're trying to really address, regardless of your scale, is being able to dynamically manage the stocking rate you have to the carrying capacity of the land. And both of those things are going up and down all the time. And this is just some of the additional analytics within Maya Grazing, which helps you track your conversion of precipitation into consumed grass as a proxy for producing pounds of beef, etc. So without sort of further ado, Jim, I'll, we've got a whole bunch of questions that have been coming pouring in.
Okay.
I'll just open up my little Q&A box here. The first one from Steve, I think we've just covered that off then, but it's how do you track and measure temporary subdivision in Maya of a difference of 70-day recovery within a permanent paddock boundary? We've sort of just gone through it in a little bit of detail there, but Jim, do you have any comments on that?
I think you pretty well got it.
Yeah, but what we might do, Steve, is we'll get in contact with you afterwards, and we'll go through in a bit more detail. Another one here from Anonymous, and that's completely all right too. We've got a few Anonymouses on the call. It's a common name actually, just a bit like Smith. But how can you tell if your pasture is stagnating, Jim?
Okay, this is where it becomes important a little bit to understand some of the individual plant species and how many leaves they'll put out. But the easiest way is if you're, let me come back and say, in a productive environment where we're going to have multiple growth cycles in a year. If you have leaves senescing, turning yellow, turning brown on the lower part of the plant, and either no new leaves appearing on the top or leaves senescing at a faster rate than new leaf appearance at the top, you're in a stagnant state. And what happens is more and more, as individual plants become larger, more photosynthetic energy is required just for maintaining that plant structure. And that's why we do not add additional feed once the plants get to that point.
Great, thanks, Jim. One from Clay. Good to see you on the call, Clay. What concerns for healthy rumen function exist when moving daily or every other day, if at all?
Okay. If we look at protein utilization by ruminants, and specifically protein supplementation, is we know that ruminant animals function well if they are consuming protein, every 3 or 4 days. People, dogs, pigs, any monogastric animal has to consume intact amino acids every day, because in a ruminant animal, it is the microbes creating protein. They do not need intact amino acids every day. So you can throw a protein supplement at that animal every 3 or 4 days, and it's going to perform well. So if we think about this in the context of grazing, if the animal can be put to a new pasture, consume a high level of protein on day 1 in a period, we know that that cow is going to be fine, for 3 days in there. But if we have marginal protein availability and they high grade out all of that protein on the first day, and we leave them in there for 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, they go into a protein deficient state. They, lose body condition. And why do they lose body condition? Because the rumen is not properly functioning. We have protein energy, or if you want to say nitrogen carbon ratio, it is out of the optimal range for rumen function. So if you're moving 3 days or less, and I learned from reading Vazan way back in the 1970s, the importance of, from a forage utilization standpoint, of shortening the grazing period. But it took me 20 years to fully understand that we are also managing rumen function as we shorten the grazing period. So I basically feel like anything less than 3-day grazing period, you're going to have healthy rumen function. It's when we go longer than that we get into issues.
That's great. That's great, Jim. And, it's really taking it to that sort of next level, really. It's not just about fence design. Let's stick up some schematics and show where people to put water and wire. It's really, taking it beyond that. So there's some great questions. And I should say that we've got so many questions that for those that we don't get to on the call, we've just gone an hour. We've still got hundreds of people on the call, which is absolutely wonderful. We'll keep going a little bit more, but for those questions that we don't get to, we'll make sure that we get a direct answer from Jim. I'll hold him to it. Another great one. How valuable is good water for gain? Should I ask the neighbour to tie into his water? In brackets, it crosses my land if mine is very hard. Now, I think it depends how well you get on with your neighbour, first of all. And I assume you're saying it's hard water, not water solid in the pipes in the middle of winter. Jim, over to you.
Okay. Some real classic research done in Manitoba, PAMI, Prairie Agricultural Management Institute, I think is what PAMI stands for. They compared cow-calf performance, cows drinking directly from a dugout to cows drinking dugout water but run to a stock tank, so they weren't directly drinking out of the dugout. And they saw a 20 to 30 pound increase in calf weaning weights. There's similar work from South Dakota, but I know a number of, what I would just call producer testimonials out of the US Northern Plains and the Canadian prairie provinces, where they talk about anywhere from 20 to even up to 50 pounds increased weaning weight when they go to pipeline and tank water rather than drinking out of dugouts or ponds. So it's profound. It's a big factor. We've seen certain projects, water development projects, where the investment in the water infrastructure actually was paid for simply by improved animal performance. We usually tie it to improved grazing distribution, harvesting more AUDs per acre, and that's how we pay for the water systems. But I've seen case studies where producers have maintained that simply improved animal performance paid for the water development.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I've got there's a whole bunch of questions around the theme of managing your stock density in high precipitation periods or areas. Both questions coming in on during the growing season and the more the dormant season. How do you manage that when with the intensity and what's your experience there?
Okay. I saw the question says on your pivot area, if you have a wet period, do you take the stock off to avoid soil compaction? Basically,
yeah, that's one of the questions. Yeah, sorry, Jim. That's one of the questions. There's been a few other variations come in, so that'd be a good one to start with.
Yeah, basically, in our environment, all right. So our total natural precipitation is a little less than 8 inches a year. We do not get enough natural precipitation to create mud. We will adjust the rate of movement of the pivot and things like that to avoid hugging pastures. In an irrigated situation, it's very manageable. If you create the problem, well, you're the one who screwed up, and just try not to do it again. In Missouri, you can get 3 inches, 5 inches of rain in a thunderstorm overnight. You go out in the morning and you say, oh my God, that pasture is wrecked. It's totally plowed. We turned it black. If you leave the stock on there for another day, yeah, it'll be a couple of years before that recovers. If the stock are immediately moved off to another pasture, then we tend to see very little long-term effect. Rarely over my 40 years that I've been doing this have I found reason to move stock more than once a day. Wet conditions are one of those times when I would move stock 2, 3, 4 times a day, just to get them off of the pasture that had gotten the 3, 4, 5 inches of rain on it. My experience has been the damage really occurs while the animals are on there, and in the few subsequent hours after the precipitation event ends. If you leave the animals there, it's going to be detrimental to the pasture. If you move them off, and it's really, bizarre to me that the adjacent paddock, it just got the same 3, 4, 5 inches of rain, but if there's been an hour's break from the time when that rain fell to where you put them in there, we don't have near the pugging problem. That's during the active growing season. During the winter, a wet winter, it's totally different ballgame. And climate has changed enough. I look at Missouri, the first 10 to 15 years that we were in Missouri, we had very minimal mud problems in winter because the ground froze, and it would stay frozen for a month at a time. It is very rare in much of the U.S. Midwest now in the wintertime, the ground actually freezes to where you can have cattle out there grazing. And so I'm much more concerned about pugging damage in the winter and the use of a sacrifice area than I am in the summertime. And it took me a long time to come to accepting the idea that you might have to have a developed sacrifice area where you can take cattle off of pasture in the wintertime, put them on concrete or cob pile or something, and feed them hay, because the damage to the pasture is just too severe if you leave them out there in a wet, muddy winter. God, I love cold weather.
Very good, very good. Look, I'm going to have to apologise to everyone. We've got literally dozens of questions we won't be able to get to. We've gone well past the hour now, but another one related to goodness me, I've just lost it. But Brandy's, thanks for sending this one through. It's about the frequency of moves and healthy rumen, etc. But Brandy's question was, how would the 3-day move with a healthy rumen correlate to conception rate of the cow?
I'd expect it to be a non-factor. If you're rotating cattle on a 3-day basis with adequate pasture, there's no reason why I shouldn't say that. I was going to say there's no reason why cows shouldn't conceive. If you have an excess protein content, like you are grazing short, very lush pasture, and it's 25%, 30% crude protein, which is possible, that is where you will get in trouble with reduced conception rate because of the elevated blood urea, nitrogen level there. So the way we tend to avoid that is let the pasture get a little more maturity on it, or keep, if pasture conditions are like that, you keep a dry, medium quality grass hay out there, free choice for them. They will do a very good job of balancing rumen function if they had the feedstuffs available to do it. And a 7 to 8% crude protein grass hay is a great supplement for assisting rumen function in the lush time of the year. What a lot of people would call washy grass. They just need some dry fiber to balance it.
Great, thanks so much, Jim. Like I said, we'll get an answer to all of those questions that didn't come through. What I'd like to do is thank you, Jim, for making time available to us again. It's great to run a session which, like I said earlier, it's not just a matter of putting up some details on designs of where to put fences up and where to put water, etc. It's gone well and truly beyond that. I think there's through the comments on the sidelines between participants and other questions coming through, there's definitely more room to develop some other themed webinars associated with this. So keep your eye out, everyone. If you want to get in touch with us, please do. The details are on the screen of how to get in touch with Jim and how to get in touch with us to arrange a one-on-one private run through with Maya Grazing and how it may apply to your planned grazing operations. The other thing is just stay on the line after the presentation ends. There'll be a page that has a bunch of other links, and we'll be sure to keep you in the know of when that podcast comes through with Jim as well. I'm looking forward to listening to that one. So until next time, we'll see everyone, and happy grazing. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank y'all.